In my November 15th, 2021 blog post titled "With Regrets to Donald Bailey," I praised the wonderfully creative drummer Donald Bailey Sr., and I told the story of how back in the early 1980s I dismissed a suggestion to interview Bailey for Modern Drummer magazine. And I go more into depth on what happened there during this interview. You can listen to that. But decades later, I was more familiar with Bailey's playing and discography, best known probably for his work with Jimmy Smith. Bailey also had many first-class albums with Hampton Hawes, Jimmy Rowles, Harold Land, Esther Phillips, Lou Donaldson, and others. But by that time, Donald Bailey Sr. had died, and I regretted my earlier decision to pass on even asking if he would consent to be interviewed. So fast forward about 2 more years, October 1, 2023, since I wrote my Regrets to Donald Bailey blog post, I received a reader response to that blog post, and it read, "Hey, Scott, I would love to talk to you about my father. Just came across your blog today." The sender was Donald Bailey Sr.'s son, Donald Bailey Jr. And as it turns out, Donald Jr. is also a drummer. So I jumped at the chance to make amends for my 1980s lack of judgment. And Donald Jr. and I had 2 conversations. One late May 2024, and then we had a second conversation just to button up some loose ends in mid-July 2024. This interview is a combination of those 2 conversations. Bailey Jr. Shares a lot of great insights into his dad as a human being, as well as his playing as both drummer and chromatic harmonica player. I didn't know Donald Bailey Jr. was a chromatic harmonica player. That was new to me as I was doing some crash coursing for this interview, trying to catch up with the long discography of Donald Bailey Sr. on record. So Junior and I covered the same ground I would have covered with his dad for the most part, and I sincerely appreciate Junior's willingness to A, reach out to me, and then B, speak twice with me on the record about his dad. This is an interview I view as important because Donald Bailey Sr. is an important drummer. He was an inventive guy, as you'll learn from this interview. A lot of neat inventions, including making his own hi-hat cymbals and why he decided to do that. And just a great player, just a real swinging, inventive player. So enjoy this interview. Also invite you to visit my blog, scottkfish.com, for lots more interviews and posts. And again, thanks to Donald Bailey Jr., and enjoy this interview about his dad, Donald Bailey Sr.
Yes, good afternoon, sir.
Hey, Mr. Bailey, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mr. Fish. How about yourself?
Good. Please call me Scott. That'd be great. And how do you?
All right. You have to not call me Mr. Bailey.
All right. It's a deal. How would you like to be referred to?
You can refer to me as Donald. Yeah.
Donald. Okay. It's a deal. I can do that.
All right.
Well, this is great. Talking about you and about your dad has been a little over 40 years in the making when Jim Keltner, the drummer, who was just a tremendous help, not only to me when I was managing editor of Modern Drummer magazine, but to the magazine as a whole. He really was instrumental in getting the magazine connected with some well-known drummers for interviews, and just a great promoter of the magazine. And one of the drummers Jim mentioned to me was your father, first of all. And
wow.
I did not get to interview your dad at the time. But
I saw that. That's why I reached out to you when I read that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did because he was another one who came and went before I had a chance to. I wouldn't say before I had a chance. I always had the chance. I just didn't take the chance. But Cozy Cole was another one. I mean, there were a few drummers like that who, for a number of reasons, one included this was pre-internet, so the magazine each year had limited numbers of interviews to do. Right, once you,
okay,
and then and it also started out as a 4 issues a year magazine, and a 6-issue a year, 9-issue a year, and finally 12 issues a year. But
that's right, because it didn't come out. It was not monthly.
Not in the beginning. No, it took
it
took a couple of years for it to come out. So I've been crash coursing your dad for the last several weeks. It's been fun, and it's as I've done throughout my life with drummers. A drummer will catch my ear. And then I'll end up digging deep on that drummer. In your dad's case, I didn't realize how many records he has to his credit. It's like, wow. So that's going to be fun. I've got a lot of listening to look forward to. But I thought I'd start out because there's a mystery about your dad. He's
all right.
He's recorded a lot. But if I was asked to walk into a crowded room, and find your dad, how would you describe him? Who am I looking for in that room?
Well, you're looking for someone definitely out of the norm. I wouldn't say my dad was, somewhat eccentric, quiet. He would definitely not be the loudest guy in the room, unless he wouldn't be somebody that would necessarily want to have drawn attention to himself. He wouldn't have just stood out in the crowd like some people do to height, weight, or just being very vocal. My dad was more quiet. Let his playing and stuff speak for his personality. Okay.
And was he a big guy?
No. My dad was probably about 5'11", maybe close to 6, on the thin side.
Yep. Okay.
For pretty much most of his life.
It was fun to watch Jimmy Smith Trio with your dad on Oscar Brown's show.
Oh yeah,
from the
USA. 50s. Yeah, that show.
And then one of the later videos of your dad, he appears to be at an assisted living facility with a group of pickup guys. He's clearly the best of the group in terms of musicians, and he's playing both harmonica and he's playing drums. Have you seen that?
Then listen, and interesting enough, those guys that he was with, one of them is Henry Franklin Skipper. One of them is, I want to say, Count Basie or Duke Ellington, one of his piano players.
Wow.
And then later on, Donald Dean came along in that group. That was in California, which is where he ended up passing away. Donald Dean ended up being the drummer of Les McCann fame.
Okay. Well, that was fun to watch your dad, and he's playing at the end of it. He's on drums, and I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but as far as the drum kit, your dad has had some interesting drum kits over the years. That one that he's playing at that assisted living facility, what's the story with that drum kit? It looks kind of like a kid's drum set, but
I think if I remember right, it was a set of was it an extremely small?
Yeah, red drums and.
Yeah. It was clearly something he put together. But I do know what you're talking about. My father I had literally, when I got my father's stuff after he passed away, I had this brush. I'm trying to think of, he had something taped, a maraca or something taped to a brush. And I kept saying, what kind of brush is this? I've seen this brush before. Somehow or another, he had a toilet bowl brush and just something else attached to it. He made just like that. So I'm going to use that for a musical instrument.
Well, with the piano trios and the organ trios of the 50s and 60s, you think back to the drummers in those bands and, Red Holt with Ramsey Lewis, and they often would augment their drum kits with percussion instruments, tambourines, bells, all kinds of things. And So it doesn't surprise me that and I can hear your father. In fact, one of the last things I listened to before this interview was I'm Moving On album by Jimmy Smith. Grant Green's on that album. And on that cut, I'm Moving On, I'm laughing listening to your dad because he's playing his butt off. And I don't know what he's doing. I don't know how he's getting the sounds that he's getting, but he's got a tambourine working in there somewhere. He's got cymbals going all the time, and he's clearly behind a drum set, but it just cracked me up because it sounds great, but no idea how he was doing what he was doing on that. and there are several Donald Bailey tracks like that.
Oh, absolutely. Now, did you have his Blueprints of Jazz album?
I had one cut on on YouTube from that. Fifth House, I think, was the track.
Yeah,
but I looked high and low to see if there was a way I could either listen to it in full on YouTube or buy the digital version of it, and I just can't find it.
If I don't have an actual physical extra copy, I'll burn you a copy of it.
Beautiful. Yeah, that was a great band.
Several somewhere, yeah.
The other one that surprised me, and I'd like to talk about it a little further into the interview, was So in Love, where your dad's playing the chromatic harmonica. And what a great album that is.
Recorded over in Japan.
Yeah.
Because Scott, nobody wanted to record him over here. I don't know. I'll tell you the story. So people think George Benson, he didn't just start singing. George Benson had been singing for years.
Right.
But the record company's mentality, especially for jazz artists, well, if you do this, you play guitar, don't try and do anything else. Of course, now it's completely different. So a lot of companies didn't record George. And when George finally, somebody recorded him and he got to open his mouth, look what happened. The rest is history.
Yeah.
Well, same thing with my father. There's record company, they wouldn't record him over here on harmonica. So when he went and lived over Japan, by the way, there's at least somewhere in the neighborhood 20 to 40 albums that my dad has recorded over in Japan.
Wow.
Some of them you find on eBay, and they're very expensive to get. The record company, I've been trying, every time I try to reach out to somebody to see if I can get a copy of it. Somebody I know, this is a Japanese artist, there's a Japanese drummer that Dad did an interview with, and he was a kid at the time.
Yeah.
And then there's another lead drummer, George, I forget his last name. But anyway, so Dad recorded all these up, and that's where that album ended up being recorded. But it was never out for years. It's only I was surprised to find it on YouTube.
Bought my copy through Apple iTunes. Yeah. It's a strong album, you know. The playing's great, the band's great. It said it was recorded in 78 and released in 1980.
Yes, released, but not over here.
No. Well, thank God for digital. I mean, I wish back when I started drum interviews and researching drummers and things, the internet had been around, because what a blessing in terms of available information and the videos and the digital music. It's just phenomenal.
Absolutely. Or even for you to have been around with Dad and Jimmy Smith, a lot of stuff. There's some footage on YouTube of Fats Domino is doing one half of the concert. Jimmy Smith is doing the other half. and my father, you can actually see my father walking out of the suit. Jimmy's working on the organ. I think it was a break, and he was looking for them to come out. But they came out, and they augmented segments. Roy Montreal, Fats, the guitar player, actually played a couple songs with Jimmy for some reason, because Quentin wasn't there. But this concert was recorded overseas in, I think, Paris. The footage is not really that great. We didn't have YouTube to capture a lot of this stuff back then.
Can you tell me a little bit about your dad's growing up? I mean, what I'm reading is something to the effect of Donald Bailey grew up in Philadelphia. He frequented clubs. He learned locally, and then when he was 18, he got the gig with Jimmy Smith, and that's it. But what about where he grew up? His home life? Was that a musical?
He grew up in Germantown, Pennsylvania. Actually, it's supposed to be around not too far neighborhood that I believe they said Bill Cosby may have lived around the corner. Is one of the stories I heard.
Okay.
It turns out that My father's father, I would actually be considered a third-generation drummer.
Okay.
My father's father was a drummer, but we didn't know that because my father's father never talked about it. We figured he may have been a frustrated musician, but it was literally Scott. My father was probably playing. He was a prodigy, just naturally. He was always beating on things, and my grandmother decided they need to get him some drums or something to beat. Always beating on something as a kid.
Okay.
He grew up. His brother Morris Bailey was into music also. He was singing and doing some other stuff, but he kind of helped my father along with drumming. But my father ended up finding out his father played drums when something happened one New Year's Eve, and his dad got, drunk or whatever, was upset. And he literally listened to my father practice drums for 5 years is what I heard. And just smoked his pipe and just kind of listened to Dad and never said anything. Then something happened. He said, that's not, you're not playing that right or something. And my dad, of course, being young, asked him what he knew. And he had my father get up. And he did everything except twirl the sticks. My father's face was on the floor, of course, because he had no idea his dad not only knew about, he was an amazing drummer. He took him upstairs. There's a professional picture of him. He showed my father a professional picture of him behind a drum set in a suit and never talked about it again.
Just that one time?
Just that one time.
Wow. Do you know, was there a teacher, a regular teacher in your dad's life?
There was a teacher. I don't know his name. And unfortunately, I said, man, there was so much I wish I had been able to ask Dad while he was still around. But I can tell you his influences were Baby Dodds and Sonny Greer.
Really?
That whole thing of setting up, that he said he got that idea of the slanted setup and just adding, stuff. But definitely Sonny Greer and Baby Dodds is his drum influences.
There were two questions that I wanted to ask. One was about the unique angling, I'll call them, or the way your dad set up his drums, where they were, instead of being horizontal with a slight tilt, they were almost vertical, at least the snare and the small tom at times. And I wondered if you could talk about that, how your father arrived at that setup, and did he ever talk about why he was using that setup?
And it's interesting because I just recently, I started seeing these clips, of course, of Dad with Jimmy Smith. And when I looked at that, I said, well, wait a minute, Dad's snare, he had a slight tilt. He never played the drums, the snare being flat. Mm-hmm. But it had a slight tilt. And I was kind of curious of myself because when I went to see my dad play live, when I was old enough to go see him play live, he had that slant.
Okay.
That were, like you said, it was almost vertical. And he said in part, Sonny Greer, something about Sonny Greer's setup inspiring him to do that. But also it made sense, especially when I started having my own problems with my shoulder and wrist playing. It actually made sense because it allowed you to bring the set in closer and have a different physical angle. However, if you're like trying to fly around the drum sets with all these fast rolls and stuff, it's the flat setup, of course, is the best way to go. Mm-hmm. But he pretty much told me what I remember. It had something to do with seeing Sonny Greer.
Well, now that you mention that, I'm thinking back to a lot of big band drummer photos I've seen from the 40s, probably, maybe the 1930s, which is in part Sonny Greer's era. And the drummers were sitting a lot higher above the snare drum, and they did have a pretty severe angle on the snare drum. And I think that was about the only way they could sit that high and play those drums. So who knows?
Well, in part, Scott, too, I think my father was, at one time, he was sitting on a bar stool. So I think a lot of those guys didn't have drum thrones.
Right.
And if you were playing in a bar stool was something that was handy. But it certainly does work better the higher up you sit.
Yep.
And I remember my father, one time sitting, it seemed like he sat a lot higher in his younger years, but as age and things took over, he began to sit lower.
Okay. There's an interview of your dad online, and he mentions, I think he refers to a drummer named Ed Curry from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell?
I don't know who that is, but yes, I've heard that name.
Do you know anything about Ed? Is it Ed Curry? Do I have that right?
I couldn't even tell you that, Scott. It sounds familiar.
Okay, but we don't know anything about him.
No, because I was just curious, because I can tell you my father, because I didn't start off playing drums.
Yep.
I started off playing saxophone, but drums were always around the house. But my father was always on the road, so I thought I needed his permission to ask to play them. And I ended up playing them when I graduated from high school because I didn't have a school instrument. I had, back then they gave you school instruments. You could take them home and practice with them.
Yeah.
And I did sax, and then I said, well, drums are around, I'll start playing them. And then my father literally came home off the road, and he said, well, I was wondering when you were going to start playing these. And I said, well, I thought I wasn't supposed to touch them. He said, you dummy, that's why I had them out there. He didn't want to push me into the drums, but I think he thought I was just naturally gravitate to it, but I was so afraid. But I brought this up to say, my father, he said, when people would ask him, how did he do something, or how did he, come about learning the drums? And it was so natural. He said he didn't know how to explain to people. And it wasn't that he was like trying to be secretive, like I don't want anybody to know what I practice. But he said, I can't tell you because everything came so natural. It's like when people would ask, I had a drummer ask me the other day, did you play a 5-stroke roll with something? I said, man, I can't tell you what, if I have to think about drumming in that I don't want to drum. I can't tell you if I was playing a 5-stroke roll, paradiddle, flamadiddle, or whatever. I was just playing. And I said that to say that about my father's ability. His ability came natural. And I'm sure it came to him through his dad.
One of my favorite takeaways from all the interviews I've done was with Roy Haynes, and I was asking him about rudiments and how he used it. That's a way of thinking, and with some drummers, right?
Yes, sir.
And he looked at me and he said, "Not everything I play has a name." Bingo. There's a great lesson right there. So you've got your dad's drums at home. When he was home, did he work out of books at all? What was his input?
When Dad was home, Dad, for the first 10 years, Dad was with Jimmy Smith. And that's when my dad traveled the world with Jimmy Smith. Well, we wouldn't see him for months. When my dad decided to leave the road because he got tired of flying, I'll tell you how we ended up in California. But when he left the road and he started working in California, my father worked nights. So I'm going to school in the daytime. And by the time, we get home or doing whatever, Dad's leaving to go work.
Yeah.
So I never saw my dad. I can tell you, though, my dad didn't read music early on.
Okay.
When he went with Jimmy, and as a result, he had came to town, and Earl Palmer was a famous drummer that had all these gigs.
Yeah.
He was so happy when my dad came to town, and my dad had to tell him he couldn't read. He had all these. He figured my dad could do all this studio work. So I didn't see my dad books and all studying and all that. No, none of that. Most of the stuff that they learned, as well as stuff that I learned back then, were from records.
Okay.
And listen, that's before those fake books and all that stuff came out. I was telling people, when we went to the jam session, or my father sent me on a gig, he didn't say, hey, make sure you listen to such and such and such and such and such. It was just you need to know how to swing, play a bossa, play lap, play 3/4, play whatever time, and be ready to listen. You had to go in with your ears. Mm-hmm. And even if you didn't have music in front of you, you needed to figure out what that artist was doing if you want to keep working.
Which describes your dad's approach, because as I listen to him, it's he's not he's the drummer. So he's doing all of the things great musicians expect of drummers, timekeeping, supporting the other band members. But he's right there creating during the moment, particularly like with Jimmy Smith and where everybody's improvising and the conversations are going back and forth. I mean, I'm just listening to your dad playing, and I laugh because it's so beautiful. It's as if he's just one entity behind a drum set and expressing himself not in any predetermined way. You know, here's something I've been woodshedding. He's just hearing the music and responding on the drum set, just like a constant and never breaking the line. And beautiful to hear that playing.
And you know what that comes from, Scott?
What?
When my father, he was playing around town, and I forget who he told, but he said some drummer came. He said, man, there's this guy named Jimmy Smith, and he's getting ready to start. He needs a drummer, and he needs a drummer that plays just like you. So my father, they had he said they had one rehearsal and went out on the road. Scott, there wasn't no set list like we're going to play Birds of Beauty and whatever and standards and all that. He said they never knew what Jimmy was going to. Jimmy would just start playing. And then literally all that stuff, that's the way you summed it up is precise. You had to be ready. And he was ready. So he spent 10 years of doing that. Of not knowing, when they went in the studio and stuff, but when they were out playing, he said he didn't know what Jimmy was going to call up and play.
One aspect of your dad's playing that I hear about quite often is how I've heard it described as instead of playing a shuffle beat with just his ride cymbal or his left hand, he's got the on the beats on his hi-hat.
Yeah.
I'm thinking he just heard it that way, that wasn't something, again, predetermined. But did you ever talk with your dad about that? That's a very signature.
Not only predetermined, he made that. There's a lot of beats out there that father that he doesn't. Joey DiFrancesco, we were at Steamers, and he called up and he said, this such and such Jimmy Smith album has this beat. Now, mind you, Joey knew I was in the audience, but he didn't know what I knew. And he said, the drummer that invented this beat is Donald Bailey, and his son is out in the audience. Let's call him up here to play this song.
Oh, man.
And it's like, I said, Joey, what if I didn't know I knew how to play? But what if I didn't know how to play Dad's beat? He literally had never heard me play.
Wow.
But he said that to say, Joey, he said, listen, I know there's a lot of things. We know your dad invented that beat. So
that was a predetermined beat your dad worked out?
Yeah, he worked it out on the stage with Jimmy.
Okay.
Just something that happened that came about through years of, I guess, just him playing. He may have had ideas in his head that he worked out, but as far as that's just something he created while he was playing with Jimmy.
Okay. Did you ever talk with your dad about how to get the best sound out of a set of drums?
No, we really didn't discuss sound as to how to get sound out of drums. I just remember him having at the time they had the calfskin heads were real popular.
Yep.
And he would always talk about how out of tune the drums. If he left them at the lighthouse, how out tuned they would literally be the deck. He would have to retune them.
There was another Philly musician your dad is said to have been influenced by, a piano player, Hassan Ibn Ali.
That's the name. Yeah, that's the other name I heard. I don't know anything about him. Okay. But that's somebody his brother, my dad's brother, Uncle Morris, knew.
There are albums that have come out since, quote-unquote, lost albums people have found from the period. But Max Roach did a trio album with Hassan, I guess back in the 1960s that Atlantic Records released. And I had it at the time. It was a little beyond my hearing ability. If I listened to it today, I'm sure I would hear things that I didn't hear back then. Okay, it's just curious the way it's written in the papers that, or online, that this was somebody, a local guru musical, good pianist, but also a musical theoretician who worked with, shared ideas with Lee Morgan and all the royalty of Philadelphia musicians.
That's what I heard about this guy.
Okay.
And man, I wish, I know I'm jumping around too, but Judy, he heard about my dad and he said, I saw your father and he had 2 ashtrays that he had put together and used it of his hi-hats. I think I want to say either I want to say it's Lewis Hayes. Was Lewis Hayes? Whoever Tootie Heap was good buddies with, I'm not sure if it was Roy Haynes or Lewis Hayes, but they were both down listening to my dad playing. And Tootie said, listen, when we heard your dad, we knew your dad was going to be somebody special.
Yeah. 2 ashtrays, huh? That's amazing.
Reason why you hear, the other thing is, those cymbals that Dad had, I don't have them anymore, the hi-hats, but they're not ordinary hi-hat cymbals. And this speaks to Dad's creativity. If the organ, recording with the organ, especially the bass line and playing with the organ, Dad knew he needed something to cut through that bass line.
Okay.
And the reason why you hear those hi-hats like that is not just because of Van Gelder's recording techniques, but because of those cymbals that Dad got to use for hi-hats. And the story Dad told me, they work so well, Art Blakey asked to use them on some of his recordings. With some of his recordings.
If you go back and look at that footage of Jimmy Smith Trio with Oscar Brown in the 50s, there's a shot of your dad's hi-hat, and it looks like a rectangular wedge cut out of both cymbals.
Yes, he did that because my dad also worked in a machine shop.
Okay.
So he couldn't stay in working in a machine shop because it turns out he's allergic to brass. But my dad was very inventive, so that was just to help them close faster.
Now, are those the hi-hats you're talking about when you say
Yes, sir.
Okay. And those are the ones that Art Blakey asked to use sometimes?
Art Blakey asked to use them. Art Blakey, my dad, whatever drums he had, they sounded so terrible. Art Blakey told my dad to meet him somewhere in New York. He gave my dad a set of drums.
Nice.
And I believe some of the early Jimmy Smith pictures, something, those drums are in there.
We'll stick with your dad's drums since there appears to not be a Donald Bailey drum set, that there were many, and back during that time, the 50s and 60s, a lot of drummers, the money wasn't there for them to take their own stuff on the road, so they maybe could bring a snare, maybe could bring their cymbals with them and play on the gig. But what was it like for your dad? I mean, did he have cymbals that he liked to bring with him? Did he have a snare? Any?
He had a set. I have the original ride cymbal. The hi-hats broke apart.
They did, those ones with the wedge?
Oh, yeah. They broke. I don't know what kind of metal, but they literally just broke.
So those weren't modified off-the-shelf K's or A Zildjians?
No, they weren't.
Your dad made those?
I won't say he made them, but I'm going to say they were not hi-hat cymbals.
Okay, interesting.
And I know exactly the metal and feel and sound. When I find that I'm going to do something with them.
You'll be the next Zildjian cymbal magnate guy.
Now, are you familiar with a drummer named Jesse Simpson?
No.
He makes cymbals. He was actually a student, I guess I would say one of Dad's proteges or students when he was up in the Bay Area.
Okay.
But I have the original ride cymbal that's on, Hampton Hawes, Esther Phillips, all kind of albums. I have that. The bell had an issue, so somebody put a washer in the middle so I could still go on the stand, but I'm trying to get a hold of his crash cymbal because it was a China cymbal. It has a unique sound, and those two cymbals are on a lot of those recordings that you heard Dad on.
He's had a beautiful sounding ride. Well, all his cymbals sounded great, but what was the ride you're talking about?
It doesn't, well, You got a second?
Yeah. Take your time.
Let me see if I can find it. Okay. Doesn't have, I don't see any writing, but
Wow.
I'll take a picture of it, but it doesn't have, there's no writing on it.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. Hang on a second. I take that back. There is small writing, and it appears to say K. Zildjian. Oh, let me get my readers out here. There's writing on here. It's something I can actually see this with. I think the original snare Dad had got burnt up in a fire when they had the Watts riots. There was a club called Marty's up on the hill. Guy told Dad, well, don't bother coming in. They burnt the club down. It says, made in Turkey, K. Zildjian, Istanbul.
Great. That's the ride.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All the records. I mean, that's just a very distinct, beautiful sound on that. Your dad got out of that. Did he have a preferred stick weight that he used to use? Plastic tip, wood tip?
We get into an interesting subject here. So,
did he use? You're going to tell me he didn't use sticks. He used.
Well, no, I can't quite say that. But what I've seen my dad play with, if you look at this footage, and I'll send it to you if you don't have it, if it's still on YouTube, when he's playing with Jimmy Smith at the Spats Domino concert, he was literally using, they look like 3S drumsticks.
Wow.
And the reason why, because, drummers, that's why I've always had this fascination with sticks. Before electronics, you either had to play with a lot of power or you had to be a big guy. But Dad figured, if I've got to play, I'll just play with bigger sticks. But I've seen my dad play lightly with those same drumsticks. And that's where I got my cue and things from. It's not the matter of just the sticks, but being able to play with finesse in a soft setting. Because a lot of gigs that Dad did around town, they were trio or dinner house gigs.
Right.
Where you can't go in there bashing.
Do you think he used the sticks that size with Jimmy Smith, some of the early stuff that he did in the 50s and 60s? Or do you think...
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I think so, yeah.
Wow.
I think, now, I'm going to say that as far as on the road, I'm not sure of those recordings. No.
Okay.
When they went to the recording studio, no. And I didn't see that he actually had like a favorite, I got 5 A's or 7 A's. Some of the early drumsticks I remember, they didn't even have any writing on them.
That's right.
We used to go to the professional drum shop in Vine Street across from the Musicians Union in California. And before Vic Firth came out with guaranteeing the sticks wouldn't be warped, you rolled the drumsticks.
Right. I remember that. Roll them on the glass counter.
Yeah, exactly. And when you got two that didn't roll, well, you had a good pair. It wasn't even a matter of weight.
And the guy selling you the sticks would be giving you the evil eye. What are you rolling sticks for? Come on. I don't have time for this.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm buying a stick that's shaped like a bow, with a bow and arrow. This cymbal, Scott, I really have wanted, I was going to take it out on some gigs, but I'm just afraid to come, if somebody ever finds out and it's gone.
Yeah.
Walk off. You would think that nobody would say anything, but we did a gig New Year's Eve and somebody walked off with the tip jar and in front of a crowd of people.
Oh.
Jesse Simpson, that drummer, he reverse engineer to make a cymbal that's kind of like this one that Dad has.
And the Chinese cymbal, that's on a lot of his records too. That's a great sounding cymbal.
That's the one I'm trying to get a hold of. I'm sure it's a K2, and I'm not, man, I would love to tell you, I don't know if Art gave him those cymbals or where they came from, but I know he's had them. Now that cymbal, that ride cymbal, he used for years. He got an endorsement with Pasty, they made something. I got the first cymbal they made that was supposed to be similar, but it wasn't.
Okay. The later records from the 90s into the 2000s, the sets that your dad recorded with are deeper sounding drums than I hear in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And his cymbal, still, the ride cymbal's still there, but the Chinese cymbal shows up new and being used a lot to great effect. And all your dad's cymbals always sounded great together. You know, they all worked as a set. Do you know if it was a conscious decision on your dad's part to use deeper drums, or was that just a sign of the times that's the way
how about that they probably were the studios drums?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't remember my dad taking out any drums to go do recording sessions. I think they were studio drums. Okay. And that's why they sound different.
So your dad, he's in Philly. That's his where he learns. He goes on the road. And you were going to tell me how you and the family and he ended up on the West Coast.
Yes. So my dad hated flying. Ethan Iverson, he wrote an article about my dad, do the math, piano player. Okay. And he wrote 2 articles. If you haven't read them, read the one by Ethan Iverson, do the math, and Chuck Israel, bass player, loved my father. He wrote a very, very nice article about my dad. But my dad hated flying. In fact, by the time he started recording with Jimmy, I think it might have been 2 or 3 of us, and Art Blakey was actually the house drummer. I know I'm jumping around too. Well, if it wasn't for Art Blakey, you wouldn't be hearing Dad on those Jimmy Smith albums. Art Blakey was the Blue Notes house drummer, and they were insisting on using Art. Art is the one that spoke up and said, listen, this guy's the one that plays with Jimmy all the time. You should record him.
Really?
That's why I got to hear Donald Bailey on those albums.
So if it had been left to Blue Note, the producers would have brought in Art Blakey to play on...
He was the house drummer.
Wow.
Art was the house drummer they used on recordings. And Art is the one that spoke up.
Okay.
So Dad hated flying, and Groove Holmes, I believe it was I want to say Groove Holmes, but said he had a gig for Dad where he could play 5 or 7 nights a week if he comes to California. So my dad packed up everything. We got on the train, and we came all the way to California, and the gig fell through. Ugh. So now my father's out in California, and there's a drummer named Curtis Kirk who played with the Supremes. He took my dad, Mom, and 5 kids in at the time until Dad could kind of get established with playing with some local guys.
Wow, what a great guy.
Yeah. So Curtis Kirk actually ended up being my second drum dad. You know, when I went to go out and start playing at clubs and stuff, I had influence. My dad told me, you know, what to do, what things I shouldn't do when I go out. And Curtis Kirk would always, in fact, I would go sit in on some of his jam session gigs and start learning how to play. It's funny, I didn't practice a lot of, now I think about it, I didn't even practice a lot of stuff at home. I just went up on the bandstand and kind of started playing.
Wow. Now your dad's in California. He's looking for, did he work with a manager? Did his reputation precede him, and people, once they found out he was around, that they began calling him for gigs? How did all that work?
I don't remember Dad having a manager. No. Just once they found out he was in town and he could play, he ended up somehow or another, I know one of the first guys he ended up playing with was Jack Wilson, piano player. Okay. And there's some recordings of Jack Wilson with Dad also. And then working with local, Lorez Alexandria, Esther Phillips, a lot of local artists. Harold Land. In fact, the album with Harold Land, The Peacemaker, Dad's playing harmonica on one of those too. A vibe player, I want to say his name was Dave Pike. Yep. Larry Flahive. Dad just, somebody was always calling him. He didn't have an agent.
Based on his discography, he was doing very well working and on the West Coast.
Well, he did well enough. He had 6 kids at the time. My mother didn't work.
Wow.
Now, mind you, I think my dad was also doing more because sometimes he wouldn't come home. I think he'd stay over because he'd be doing maybe two or three gigs in a day. Because some of those gigs, some of the guys, man, they used to play till morning time.
Yeah, and then after hours sessions.
Yeah.
Do you think your dad missed being home? Would he have liked to have maybe worked less and spent more time at home?
Well, definitely in the early years with Jimmy, yes. But once he was in California, I mean, we lived out in Pomona, so that was an hour drive to Los Angeles at that time, not anymore. So Dad would, for the most part, he would be home, but we didn't get to see him much in the daytime because we're in school at the time, small. He's sleeping in the daytime.
Yep.
By the time he's probably headed out to a recording session or something because that's what he did full time. He didn't teach.
Was your dad involved in any of the, on the West Coast, studio work, like the stuff that Shelly Manne and Jack Sperling and those guys with the big...
No, but primarily, like I said, that was because of his reading.
Okay. Oh, okay. So he never...
All those studio cats, what did they have in common?
They all read.
They all read their butt off, yeah. So Dad, eventually, he took up, he learned to read music and all that. But it wasn't something that was stressed when he was small.
Yep. And,
of course, when he went out with Jimmy, he didn't have to. Jimmy didn't have charts.
No, he didn't. It said.
And not only did Jimmy not have any charts, the guys who had charts, that's the other thing that's missing. When you listen to Art Blakey's music, he has horn players and they have horn lines on there. If you look, you don't see no music stands up on this bandstand.
Right.
They have to know that music and come out. And the downside of today is guys not learning the music while just reading. There's not feeling and a bunch of stuff on that paper. So you got to learn. We had to know standards.
Yep.
And I think Dad knew listening to the radio, even if they didn't have record player, have radio, that's how they learned music back then.
Yep. Your father probably knew the words to all those songs too.
Yeah.
At the time on the West Coast, did your dad had any relationship with like a drum endorsements? You mentioned Pasty cymbal endorsement.
Oh, yeah. I think he finally got an endorsement but nothing that like you'd ever see like Donald Bailey's picture with Pasty. I think they gave him some symbols and asked him what he would like. And like I said, one of them is supposed to be this dark right symbol. Now I ended up with the cymbals because Dad didn't like the way they sounded. Remo started making drums.
Yep. Yes.
Now, you remember their early drum sets? They weren't really that good. But,
right.
Yeah. Well, he ended up with that. But no really drum endorsements. I think Jimmy Rowles was somebody Dad did a lot of work with. Jimmy Rowles was doing, I want to say they were was it Florence Hendricks that was the singer? And I think Jimmy Rowles was the band. So anything that Jimmy Rowles would be involved in, he would get Dad involved in. And Dad got to meet Red Mitchell,
yep,
bass player. My understanding is Red did Red live over in Switzerland or someplace? And he was going to have the whole family have my father move overseas.
Wow.
And my mother didn't want to. There was a lot of people that loved Dad, especially when all that racism stuff was going on. And there was a lot of people that loved and were instrumental in helping Dad at a time when they weren't necessarily helping people.
Yep.
I would give credit to Red Mitchell if he was alive today, and Jimmy Rowles as being two of those guys.
Yep.
That I still got a bunch of downbeat magazines that were back in the 1950s that I did give up because he gave them to me.
So how did your dad end up in Japan? I think he's here 6 years.
Yes, he's in Japan.
What's he doing over there?
He's actually living there. My father had high blood pressure and all that. He was able to come off his high blood pressure meds just through the Japanese lifestyle and diet. He learned Japanese. Him and I correspond. I have a bunch of letters we wrote to each other, because my parents ended up divorced and my dad ended up in Japan. And over there, if you've ever been to Japan, I got a chance to go over to see my father in Japan. The Japanese were so into artists. They had a book that was literally, think of the least known jazz musician in America.
Yeah.
They knew all about him over there and had books written about that least known jazz musician. So Dad loved it over there. He was being appreciated and recognized. They had all kind of artists that wanted to record with him. So, like I said, he made, it has to be no less than 20 albums, but I think as many as 40.
Wow.
Albums recorded with Japanese artists that were famous or big at the time over there. Different artists, a lot of those musicians that are used on So in Love, those are Japanese artists.
Yeah, those guys play their butts off. Those are great players.
Yeah, they were tremendous. A lot of times they were very good learners and students. And they just wanted to take in, anything that had to do with culture, American culture, but especially jazz and R&B. So Dad went over there and just decided to stay there. He would have actually still been there, but because literally when I went to Japan, you can't stay in Japan. If you got a visa, you have to leave the country when you're visa. It's not like America. You come over here and get lost. Well, first of all, we don't look Japanese, so it's kind of hard for us to just go over there and blink.
But I'm Japanese, right?
My father, when his visa was up, they don't say you can't come back, but you do have to leave. So he'd go over to the Philippines.
How long do you have to leave before you can come back?
A week, maybe 2 at the most.
Okay.
So that's how my father lived in Japan for 6 years.
Was your dad teaching? Did he have students?
I don't know if he had students. He may have had students, but he definitely they had like record companies over there, and they were trying to get things established, so they would lean on Dad, or like I said, record Dad with these artists.
Okay.
So mainly made, if he wasn't recording with Japanese artists, like say a famous artist comes over from Japan.
Yeah.
I mean, from America. Well, they know Dad's there. They would, if they got a choice between getting Dad as the drummer and Mike, this world famous drummer to play with Jimmy Smith, as opposed to playing it with the Jap, they would get Dad if he was available. I
saw one record on a Japanese label. It was called the Drum Battle. I can't remember now who.
That's the guy I was talking. That Drum Battle. That drummer on there is the one I reached out to. Okay. He was a kid one of them is George. It's the Drum Battle. He's a famous drummer. And then it should be there's one with a guy. He's a kid.
I'd love to hear that. I'll have to see if that's available as a digital download. Did your dad teach in the States?
Like I say, he had this one drummer, Jesse Simpson.
Okay.
That he taught up in the Bay. In fact, he would kind of do the same thing he did do to me. He would just send Jesse out on these gigs. And some of the guys weren't happy to see Jesse showing up. But Jesse, I'll tell it this way. To me, when I heard Jesse play, he sounded more like my father than I did.
That's funny.
That's how much stuff he got from Dad.
And most of it was from listening and watching your dad play.
I think listening, and Dad was probably able to show, as he got older, he figured out how to be able to show or explain stuff.
Yep.
To me, because by the time that I was, learning drums, then I was also leaving the house. So I was out on my own. My dad got me involved in reading, but I was already reading music because I played saxophone.
Okay.
But I have the opposite. So I was a reader of music, but when I started playing professionally, nobody had charts. So most of the gigs I played, no one had drum charts. Drums. So my reading went to pot because I wasn't using it. I had the opposite. I started off reading music, only to not really end up reading. I started reading saxophone music, but not reading drum. I didn't play drums in high school. I read saxophone.
Red saxophone.
And when I got playing I played in R&B combos and jazz combos. Like I said, they didn't have charts. And just played music.
Are there words of wisdom about making a living or playing professionally as a drummer or a musician in general that your dad passed along that have stuck with
Oh,
you?
absolutely. He would tell people, make sure that they learned how to, he was a big proponent of making sure they learned how to read music.
Okay.
It was like I said, that whole thing, he could have been Earl Palmer's, he could have been his Earl, he had more studio work than he can handle. He needed another drummer to come take some of the studio work. And he already knew my dad could play.
Anything about character, behavior on the gigs, behavior off the gigs, anything like that? Should your dad pass along?
Yes. Well, I learned from my father. My father would always get to the performance early and set up drums and then just relax. And I do that same thing. It's not for me. If I'm not at a performance 2 hours early, I'm late. And I also learned from my drum teacher who broke it down. He said, the reason why you do that, he said, because we have to physically move these drums. And drum hardware is heavy. Yep. Drum cases are heavy. So if you're moving all this heavy stuff around, your muscles are pumped full of blood. And he said, if you do that, then you sit down and play, that's how you're going to play. With your muscles pumped you're all pumped up with energy. He said, so you want to get there and set up your drums and then relax so that you can play relaxed or feel the room out or just be in a relaxed mode.
Mm-hmm.
So doing that, really learning to listen, what my dad's great gift when he ended up even playing with Carmen McRae and all these different singers was to be able to listen to the artist and not overplay.
Yeah.
Made the artist sound good. If you listen to an album, my father's not known necessarily for his chops, but listen to Sweet Georgia Brown by Jimmy Smith live at the Baby Grand.
Okay.
My father obviously could play fast with the best of them. And that was the opening song. I said, Dad, you guys didn't even warm up? And then the song got progressively faster. It wasn't about playing chops or rudiments or any of that stuff. My dad had to me, he could play very precise, very clean. I listened to my dad do rolls and stuff.
Yeah.
And was amazed at how effortlessly he did these things. Things that he did to this day, I'm not ashamed to say, I still can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Are you Donald Bailey's son? Yeah, I am. Yeah. That's true. Yeah, I'm Junior. Yeah. I'm not going to eclipse. Things that he was doing at 18, when he was, no.
I would disagree with somebody who said he wasn't known for his well, maybe he wasn't known for his chops, but he certainly had more than enough chops. And you've just outlined it. Some of those tunes with Jimmy Smith where they'd get cranked up and your dad's just in the moment, boom, playing and
effortlessly playing. I did I'll say this, and I don't say it to be biased because Donald Bailey was my father, but every time I went to see my father play, I was literally amazed at why did he play that? Why did he play that particular phrasing or rhythm? He sounded like no other. Drummers from Jack DeJohnette, all those guys used to come. And Chuck Israel tells this story in one of his articles that a drummer was, I don't know if he's playing with Lionel Hampton, but he said, man, you got to come hear this guy play. And Chuck went and heard, he said, this guy is a genius. Flugie, I forget what the guy's name drummer was. I'll find the article and send it to you.
Okay, I'll look for it too.
Amazed because I say nobody sounded like my dad.
Right.
Nobody sounded like my dad. And there were things you were playing. Kenny Washington is funny because he said when he heard I donated some money to one of the radio stations, he said, oh man, Donald Bailey. He said, man, I used to think he was playing stuff backwards. I was just amazed by the stuff that he was doing. Kenny Washington, all kind of his peers knew what Dad was and how special his playing was.
Sometimes I think that when listening to, limited to your dad, but there are other drummers who had great ears when they played, that it's almost, I feel, it's almost a disservice when people try to convert. They want to overanalyze.
Yes,
and they want to break it down into something that's written on a page, and it's no.
Yes,
and Donald Bailey is hearing it. He's talking. He's in the middle of a conversation. You know, it's not like Roy Haynes said. Not everything we play has a name. That's your father is doing that all the time.
He's the epitome. And listen, he couldn't even tell you afterwards what he played.
Right, no doubt.
He just said, that's what came. And one of my father's sayings was, if you listen to recordings, guys try to do 100 takes of something to get a perfect recording, only to find out the first take was the best one. He said music wasn't meant to be perfect. He said whatever came out on the bandstand, that was what was meant to come out.
Right.
He said all that stuff, because listen, I can listen and tell you on some recordings when the drummer probably dropped his drumstick.
Yep.
But that was just part of playing. It wasn't meant, but he truly emphasized on me. And what I learned is to really listen to whatever artist. I never worry about who I'm going to go play with, other than I'm going to do my best to listen to what they're doing and try to accent or compliment that. And that's why Dad, from a wide range of artists that he's played with, and that's why they don't all just have something come. They're all different. But Dad was able to play with these people, and they enjoyed having him play.
Can I ask you if you were able to be with your dad when he passed?
No, unfortunately, I can tell you this. My dad was unhappy being down in Southern California at skilled nursing facility.
Yeah.
They meant well trying to bring him down, but my father was still wanting to play and play actively.
From what I saw in that tape, he was playing great.
Oh, yeah. Listen, if my father was willing to travel, there were artists all over the world that wanted to play with my dad. He just hated flying. And Joey was one of them. Joey Defense would have loved for Dad to go out on the road with him.
That would have been, yeah, boy, I would have loved to have heard.
The thing is, I knew my father was unhappy being where he was. And right before I said, Dad, Joey would love to play. He said, oh, man, I would love to play with Joey, And I was going to work all this stuff out. And Dad passed. To where they could go in the studio and record together something. He just loved my father.
Yep.
And Scott, let me extend this to you. If you decide, even after today, feel free to call me and continue to have more conversations.
I would love to. I'd love to stay. I'd love to stay in touch.
And we should meet in person.
Last topic that I had wanted to hit on was your dad's harmonica playing. I'm going back to the young guy that started playing with Jimmy Smith, and now all of a sudden he's playing beautifully chromatic harmonica, which tells me at some point in his life, from a guy who was unable to take studio gigs because he couldn't read, he must have had a pretty healthy musical knowledge to be able to play the chromatic like that. And where did all that come?
He told me he wanted to play something melodic. He could play melodies, and of course the harmonica was light and portable. He liked the sound of it, and he just literally started buying them and experimenting around and self-taught. I don't know who or if any he had any lessons, but I know he was just something he just took up and started learning.
Jeez. So you think that he played primarily by ear?
Yes.
Wow.
Oh, absolutely. He wouldn't have been reading any not back then. He wouldn't have been reading any harmonica music or anything like that.
I think we tend sometimes to elevate people who are book learned with music above the ear players, but for heaven's sake, there are tons and tons of genius ear players out there. He just plays really, really great.
Another album by Gino Vanelli. It's a song, I believe it's Storm After Sunset album. Dad is playing harmonica on that. And that was one of the first professional albums I recall that they actually called him to play.
Wow.
On Gino Vanelli's track.
Last question. How come, why this with the Chinese symbol, why is that not with you?
Well, Dad was having, I'm not sure, my father did have some issues with, he hurt his back lifting that organ. He told me when he heard it. They used to have to lift the organ over the bar. Like some of those clubs,
Oh
the organ,
God.
the clubs were upstairs. And literally they're lifting the organ up over like a bar to place it.
Wait a minute. So your dad's on the road with Jimmy Smith and the band members are having the cart around the Hammond B3?
Oh, not only cart to organ. My dad, Jimmy, used to drive around in a blue hearse. And somehow or another, Jimmy Smith also knew how to work on vehicles, so he modified the suspension. But they used to transport the hearse and the drums and the organ. Yeah, the drums, guitar, and organ around this blue hearse. And Kenny Washington has a funny story, if you ever catch up with him, that he told on the air. He said they went somewhere, and I guess Dad was laying down taking a nap, and they pulled in to get gas or something, and Dad rises up and in the back of his hearse.
Ay, the poor guy. So, okay, guys, we're at the gig. Let's get that beat. I mean, how the heck much does a Hammond B3 weigh? It's got to be like a Harley Davidson.
Listen, they're heavy because I was in an organ group, and we had to get I said, I don't know how they transport this organ, but I can tell you, Dad told me Jimmy was not. He was an incredibly strong guy for a thin guy. Because Jimmy, if you see pictures of him, he's a thin person.
Yeah.
He saw Jimmy pick up and grab. He would say the woman weighed 300 pounds and just lifted her off the ground.
Wow.
So Jimmy was strong, but yeah, they used to transport that organ around. So anyway, Dad ended up on drugs, with taking these prescription drugs and drinking alcohol and all this stuff. And somehow or another, this guy ends up with this symbol. So I know the guy who has it. I just need to find out if he would be willing to give it back to me.
Okay.
I don't know. Something that Dad gave him personally. If it meant sentimental, I'm not going to pressure him. But if he would, if I could trade him something, I would really like to get that symbol.